The topic of the presentation is To the Origins of Social Education in Ukraine, the 1920s, Humanism or Proletarian Expediency. Turning to the history of the formation of the phenomenon of social education, hereinafter referred to as soцвих in Ukraine, it is necessary not to miss the main factor that gave rise to it, the collapse of the Russian Empire, whose part Ukraine was. The establishment of Soviet power on the lands of Ukraine took place in difficult conditions of civil war, instability of power, material deprivation and economic decline. Despite this, the Ukrainian Bolsheviks declared a difficult for realization task to fundamentally change all the political, economic and cultural institutions of the previous imperial power that implied the creation of a new socialist in spirit educational system. It was based on the idea of replacing the upbringing of the younger generation in a semi-patriarchal family and school with social upbringing. It meant their upbringing in collectivistic ideology oriented towards the interests of the working class. Until the middle 1920s, the issue of the dying out institutions of family and school in their original forms in the proletarian state was being actively debated. However, the traditional approach to the important role of the family in the upbringing of the child prevailed. We'd like to emphasize that in 1918-1922, the soцвих in Ukraine was simultaneous, a means of protection of a child and included education, upbringing, providing food and clothing for children and adolescents who suffered the consequences of war. There are several reasons for investigating this phenomenon. Firstly, in order to spread knowledge about the historical and cultural processes in Ukraine, as the educational sphere is a vivid reflection of the nation's image and intellectual history of the country. Secondly, on the basis of a discursive analysis of authentic sources and documents of the 1920s to reveal the presence in the history of the Ukrainian education such a phenomenon as soцвих, having no analogues in the world history of pedagogy. Authorities proclaimed the necessity to cover all over the child population of Ukraine with possible social care, elementary education, despite the extremely difficult post-war social and economic circumstances. It was proclaimed as the task of the authorities at the level of state-approved laws and regulations. Thirdly, the studied phenomenon soцвих concerned the origins of those processes in education that are defined as humanistic. Let's remember, experimental studies of the child's nature began only from the second half of the 19th century, and the historical and genetic reconstruction of the phenomenon soцвих at the same time makes it possible to reflect the movement of humanistic ideas and their practical realizations. The urgency of introducing the system of revolutionary activities in Ukraine education in the context of social protection of children was due primarily to the socio-economic consequences of the First World War and Civil War, such as destruction of families, famine, devastation. As a result, numerous orphans and half-orphans from poor families, refugees without shelter, that is, a large number of homeless and neglected children in need of help and protection appeared. In the 1920s, penal facilities for juvenile delinquents were changed to educational and labor institutions, labor colonies or labor communes. Some of them were open-type facilities, but most of them were closed-type ones. Alexander Makarenko became one of the founders of the Soviet penitentiary pedagogy. The activity of Ukrainian pedagogical state institutions, which first of all cared for the primary differentiation of the child population on the basis of its examination and identification of children with normal and abnormal development, also involved the purposeful development of medical and pedagogical support, protection and laying the foundations of scientific and pedagogical study of abnormal children, contributing to the formation of the domestic branch of pedagogy, making recommendations on organizing education and socialization adequate to the peculiarities of the development and opportunities of children and adolescents, etc. In the 1920s, economic disruption and drought, famine, epidemics, and difficult political situation exacerbated the problems of homelessness and caused a significant increase in juvenile delinquency. There were about 1 million orphans and street children in Ukraine in 1922-1924. Individualized vectors of life, organization, and teaching children. So, normal children should have attended a children's home boarding school, a daytime children's home, a general 7 years labor school, a kindergarten, juvenile offenders against the law. Later, the homeless children who committed minor offenses in order to somehow survive had to attend the main orphanage, an auxiliary orphanage, labor colony, labor home for girls. Children with developmental defects were sent to the main orphanage. It seems undeniable that the declared approach meant taking into account the diversity of children's characteristics and ensuring social interests of children and adolescents in established educational institutions. Planning to reach the child with social and educational influence, the organizers of the Soviet educational system considered that meeting the diversity of the vital needs of children is the goal of the educational process. Therefore, the idea reflected in the declaration of the PCE of the social education of children that care should be provided to all children, included the sick, defective juvenile offenders, and all groups of children in need of a special educational approach became crucial. At the same time, the organizational, medical, and pedagogically reasonable foundations were laid in the 1920s to ensure individualization in the education and take care of various categories of children, although in the spirit of proletarian collectivism. We are convinced the reflection on educational past is never finished.